Longest Day is a podcast from a female-founded destination practice that believes that crisis isn't an if, it's a when. We are an organisation unafraid of crisis, but have never known one to be resolved in a single day. However long the day or night that gave rise to the crisis in the first place, there's always something we can learn. I'm Leah, the founder and CEO of Broadstairs Consulting, a problem-solving consultancy offering crisis and governance advisory services to help leaders and organisations thrive and flourish. We operate in the gap between legal and public relations, at the coalface of difficult situations, believing that most crises are avoidable and the impact of inevitable ones usually can be mitigated. Our guests have overcome a litany of crises. Many of our guests have worked with us in some capacity in the past. All of them have stories worth hearing. We trust them to make this worth your while. We hope it helps you trust us. Today's podcast guest is Tim Dixon, co-CEO of More in Common, a non-profit organisation launched following the murder of Joe Cox. More in Common has 43 staff with a presence in 5 countries, where they are helping to build common ground, counter the forces of division and hate across the world. Tim is a social entrepreneur, economist, tech lawyer, and business owner. He spent a decade working in senior political roles. He has been living and working between New York and London since 2013 and serves on an array of boards in the US, UK, and Australia. And if that's not enough, Tim is remarkably humble, incredibly kind, and has a great sense of humour. It's an immense privilege to be able to call him my friend. Let's dive straight into the longest day. You have faced plenty of crises when you've been working for prime ministers and opposition leaders. Could you perhaps summarise some of those?
Well, I guess there's the crises that are external that face you. So I was working for the Australian Prime Minister when the financial crisis hit. So that was kind of, banks are tumbling and what's happening to the global economy. And there's all kinds of people on my phone who are saying that their bank needs, deposit protection and all of those guarantees. We had the crisis of bushfires, so sort of forest fire. And in fact, as it happened, my uncle and aunt were killed in that fire. So half the way through me writing all of these speeches for the Prime Minister, I found out that, it directly affected my family. But in that context, you just kind of tunnel on because you're doing crisis communications for the country. So there's all kinds of crises that politics creates, including just being late for things or being given, 8 minutes notice for a speech that the Prime Minister's got to give in the chamber. But in a sense, what happens actually in that world is that you become so accustomed to crisis that I actually think people become addicted to it, and then they kind of struggle to rouse themselves to take to work if there's not an immediate deadline. So when I was a lawyer, for example, I used to have one of the areas I dealt with was IT and data breaches, and so that would be the classic. We have a crisis, this is going to hit the news in so many hours, what do we say? And then I've worked in humanitarian situations where, that's been working on Syria, for example, there's a kind of constant. And you're dealing with people who are living in this extraordinary trauma. Right. So you're very conscious of that, of trying to be sensitised to that, but you're also continuing to do that job every single day. So you've got to have some kind of way of managing through and not being in reaction mode all the time.
Yes, I think adrenaline in terms of responsiveness plays a huge role in a crisis, and obviously you can't sustain that for long periods of time, so you've got to regroup. Whilst all of these things have clearly been remarkable and memorable crises, I'm not sure you would describe those as the greatest crisis that you've ever experienced. Perhaps you could tell us about what your longest day was, or the greatest crisis you've experienced in your working life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hardest, the greatest crisis is when there's an intersection of your public life or your work life and your private life. And I was a good friend of Joe Cox, the Labor MP representing West Yorkshire back in 2016. And I was actually having lunch with Brendan Cox, her husband, at the time when he got a call that she'd been attacked in the street, which Initially, we thought somebody's like mistaken her, or just like there wasn't any more information. As it turned out, she'd been attacked and murdered, and Brennan was immediately on the train. And then I guess an hour or two later, he called me and told me what was about to become the public news. That was so strange at so many levels. The level of sorrow and just shock, because she had 3-year-old, 5-year-old children, and I spent quite a lot of time with them. She's an amazing mother. She's an incredibly inspirational woman who made the sacrifice of going into public life and had a huge amount to contribute to. And I was really relatively an outsider in the UK at that stage. Now, English father, so always kind of grown up with the connection, but grew up in Australia, lived and worked in the US for a few years beforehand. I'd only been in the UK maybe 2 or 3 years at that point. And Jo was the Member of Parliament that I knew best as a friend. And so it was like also really, like I'd sometimes wake up thinking that I just had this weird dream in the subsequent days, because it just, like, how would it be that the person I knew best in public life, political life, would be brutally murdered? And if you go into the history of political violence in the UK, it's never happened before that a Member of Parliament was murdered by one of their own constituents. It's relatively common in the US, or at least it's sort of it's normalised. Why did this happen? How did this happen? I'd been working on these exact issues of the rise of kind of extremism. It was terrible. It was completely paralysing. I just had this kind of thought in my head that I just wanted to get up and walk outside and just kind of walk and walk and walk and walk and walk forever. I could only kind of try to recover some sense of, I don't know, equilibrium, or make some sense of this. I guess I've always liked, the long walk. But, it was, I don't know, I guess my brain was all over the place. But the following day, the whole bunch of us who had known Jo, because she had done a lot of different things in a relatively short life, we had this snap moment where somebody said, what would Jo want us to do? Like, what would Jo do in this situation? Because we're all just distraught, in shock, but also feeling like we had some responsibility to do something with this moment. So one thing was, we thought we need to do some event to mark this, where the community, the country is coming together, because the response across the country was extraordinary. We decided to do a fundraiser for her causes. Ultimately, £2 million was raised through a crowdfunder. And what I realised as we did the crowdfunder, which was literally, it was up within 90 minutes, 2 hours, and it's just like money coming in. And it broke the crowdfunding website, that basically broke down. But then it was this realisation of, okay, actually everybody wants to help at this moment. And so, and we reflected, and we felt like this is a moment when we can define, we do not want a murderer to be the story. Often in the media cycle, it becomes the dominant story. We were like really determined. We want people to come together around Jo's values and the things that she believed in. We're really worried about women not like saying, I'm not going to get into public life. We want, what message does it send to a young woman? Out of all of that, a group of us, with tremendous support from so many people, put on a big memorial in Trafalgar Square the following week. Malala came and spoke at, and, it was a fantastic galvanising moment. But there was a real sense where people just came together. There was from across all the political divisions. I felt at that moment there was a real affirmation of the British values and the willing to come together and to say this is utterly unacceptable, and we do not have violence against people in public life in this country. The following day, we were trying to summarise what's the way to capture Jo's values, and it was from her first speech in Parliament, we have more in common than what divides us. Now, out of that came the Jo Cox Foundation, which has done fantastic work over the last 7 years. More in Common, my organisation, was also birthed out of that whole experience. So, that was part of our resolution, was we we have to affirmatively act in order to not allow evil to win. We have to turn this to good with energy and verve and the kind of optimism and perseverance that Jo had in her character. And so now I look back, and it was the longest day for me, and parts of that are still really hard to, make sense of. But at the same time, so much good has come out of this awful tragedy, and it's definitely given me a different perspective on crisis, and realising that the way that you see it in that moment, you cannot choose the circumstances, the things that happen to you or happen around you, but you can choose your response. And a group of people came together and chose to respond in a way that actually has done, an enormous amount of good in the world, and Jo would be really proud of that.
Yes, she definitely would. I just want to pick up on some things that you've said. You mentioned that this was the longest day because of the intersectionality between your private life and your public life. Would you say that this being a traumatic experience impacted your ability to respond to it in the days and weeks immediately after the event? What was your path to kind of overcoming that trauma?
I think I probably lent on my familiarity with crises, particularly from a political background. And so in some ways I defaulted almost to what I knew to do. I found it helpful to be able to feel, in that situation, I found it helpful to feel that I was doing something useful, because part of what you feel in that situation is complete helplessness. What do I do? I can't undo the kids' loss of their mother. I can't, you do feel powerless. And somehow I think part of overcoming trauma is to recover a sense of agency. And I was able to do that partly because I had that background of, if you're in the political world, as I say, there's some confected crises, there's some real crises. But one thing I got used to saying to people is, this season will pass. Like, we're in a moment now, but you'll spend the rest of your life looking back on it. How do you want to remember this moment? How did you respond? And I mean, maybe that's a little bit personality. I probably have a certain amount of detachment from circumstances that can be a negative, and you can be less in the moment with people, but then also can be a positive.
Is there anything that you wish you had done differently? I mean, obviously you and the people around you were incredibly impactful, but with hindsight,
the thing that you regret is the thing that you can't undo. Could we have done something to stop this happening, beforehand? I'd like to have another conversation with Jo, the person you've lost. One of the most important things was sharing the experience with other people, because it was that shared conversation where we all resolved that we were not going to allow ourselves, that Jo wouldn't like us to sit around, wallowing in this tragedy and sadness, and that even if it was very imperfect, there was a way of trying to turn that round. And so that felt like it was very inspired by her energy and personality, and it kind of got us onto the right track.
If you could pin down a personality or character trait that served you really well in overcoming those circumstances, what would you say?
I definitely think that ability to think into the future and look back on your current moment is that's definitely part of my makeup. And in the Prime Minister's office that one of the two Prime Ministers I served with, there was a huge turnover of staff in his first term. I was a little older than some of my colleagues, and I think having that, I had run a business that had had really hard times. and where my kind of, as are we going to survive? It was like money got stolen. I had a time when I seriously didn't have enough money to catch a train home and I had to walk home. I had really tough times in building a business, and that just felt like that was just worse existentially than having a bad day at the office working for the Prime Minister. If you've had experiences in your life, you say like, well, I got through that, so we'll get through this, and we're all doing this together as well. That sense of solidarity with others, I think, is really, really key thing. Don't make it your battle to go through alone.
Yeah, that's really sage. I think the hot topic or the word of the day post-pandemic is obviously resilience. And a lot of what you're describing is resilience. What would you say to leaders who haven't had the opportunity to build that kind of resilience in advance of the crisis that you have obviously had through your business and political career?
Well, there is real value in the mind exercise of trying to reframe a situation. Like, so maybe you're stuck in it and not sure of the way out, and it feels really frustrating. You can't see your agency in it. And this is where actually conversation with friends can be very helpful. Now, I am a communications professional. I was a political speechwriter, so I've always thought about maybe if I'm stuck, maybe there's a different way of seeing this. Maybe, in danger, there's also opportunity, in risk there can be reward. And sometimes you're so stuck that you can't imagine yourself out of that moment or see a way forward. But then that's where friends and colleagues and mentors can be really helpful to try to. Because if you can see that 5 different things can happen from where we are right now, and it might feel like the worst. It's very natural as humans to particularly get locked in a state of fear. We catastrophize, but actually there can be so many different outcomes. You're just not going to be stuck in whatever the thing is that you're in now. And I think that gives you an incredible sense of agency when you realise that. It doesn't mean that you're then the hero of your story and you alone kind of solve the problem, but you can realise, well, maybe another thing happens and another thing. Maybe there's a bit of good fortune is needed here or something to break this logjam, but we're not going to be stuck indefinitely in this moment.
For me, as a problem solver, one of the things that I particularly enjoy is that whilst you might have fixed parameters, there are an infinite number of potential solutions depending on how things play out. And as a leader, it's very easy to think that you can predict how the conversation's going to go or how things are going to turn out. And I just love the fact that you just have no idea sometimes. Yeah. And that is opportunity. Yeah. And there's a bravery that's required there. And that is underpinned by that resilience that you were talking about. I would love to hear more about the aims of More in Common.
So More in Common is partly inspired by that experience of tragedy. The heart of what we are trying to do, we're an organisation that is developing a skill set in understanding the many forces that are fracturing societies, driving people apart, and also understanding what are the forces that hold societies together, that give us more cohesion. Mostly, at least in the lives of Westerners, we've been used to relatively stable societies. There's been periods of change, but, our institutions, particularly in the post-Second World War era, until more recent years, we kind of told ourselves a story that democracies were expanding, year by year. There was a kind of this positive pathway. That's very much come undone in the 21st century. Social media is a very big part of the story, but also it's about economic insecurity, various pressures of globalisation. It's the people's loss of pride and identity in their work. What More in Common's seeking to do is to better understand those forces, not from the kind of analytical level of economy, geopolitics, those things, but much more from the perspective of people and the lens through which people, their values, identity, and how they see the world, and then try to connect, create interventions, do things that can influence those dynamics and strengthen cohesion, counter forces that seek to divide. We're trying to develop an expertise in how you deal with that, and then share that expertise and partner with organisations to help them become effective, and leaders also to become effective in navigating their way through times of division and common ground. And that ultimately is with the vision that if you can hold societies together, we can solve problems together. We're beginning to see where we can uniquely contribute among a whole ecosystem of people who are trying to deal with, like, what is the moment that our societies are facing where we need to step in and do things differently.
We'll be right back after this advert from our sponsor. This episode of The Longest Day is sponsored by Grosvenor Search, a specialist NED recruiter in the asset management space. Board diversity shouldn't be reducible to tokenism. Rather, efforts to diversify boards must be focused on ensuring that the top 5% of talent are identified, and once recruited, empowered to strengthen existing boards. Grosvenor Search offers a targeted approach to ensure that your board receives the most impressive diverse talent. For more information, email info@grosvenorsearch.com. Let's get back to today's guest. You provide these incredibly comprehensive and insightful reports that are used and relied on by a huge number of stakeholders. What kind of challenges do you face internationally with your work?
Well, we're very, very committed to solutions that come from within national or regional contexts. The forces that are dividing societies are fairly similar from one country to another, but they'll all follow different fault lines because the fault lines are different in each country. They're different. There's different geography. There's different immigration histories, racial backgrounds, class, differences, beliefs, religions, all sorts of different parts of that story. So when you might be dealing with a fracturing set of forces, like, for example, social media is always elevating extreme voices, and issues get put into a binary. It's us or them. It's this or that. There's this other group that we should all be fearful of. That story is replicated all across the world. It obviously, very different contexts. The other is different, but the psychological dynamics are really similar. But the solution, what's the story that can bring people together within the context of a Brazil or a Poland? It's different to what will in the United States. And the only people who can find those answers are people who know that context intimately. One of the biggest insights across all of our work is that the leadership in particularly civil society is dominated by highly educated urban people who increasingly do not understand large proportions and often disrespect, actually, large proportions of their population. So if you don't counter that actively, then you get stuck in the kind of, a cosmopolitan view of the world that is often very condescending, actually, to, people who are different from that.
We see that here in London, don't we? The London view of the UK versus the rest of Great Britain.
It's one of the privileges of my role is because of moving between countries, is to try to understand differences. And I see the commonalities all the time. The funniest thing I found actually is that an awful lot of those stereotypes about national differences kind of turn out to be quite true.
I think it's fair to say that people are imperfect, systems and institutions are imperfect. But we have grandiose aims as leaders that we want to go full steam ahead towards. We like to dream. So if we could dream for a moment, what do you think society would look like if More in Common achieved its aims, if it didn't need to exist anymore?
Well, I mean, in many ways, our ambition is to put ourselves out of business. That is to get societies on a healthy, even keel. That these dynamics of us versus them, the kind of the dividing dynamics and the common ground dynamics, are in better equilibrium. And when that happens, then, there is much more potential for solving big problems, for people being able to flourish. But this issue of polarisation and fracturing our societies it puts all of those things at risk. Our dream is to find the ways to put society onto a healthier trajectory, and then believing that frees us all up to do, to realise our potential as people. And it's not, we're not, idealistic to the extent of there is a perfect nirvana. Humans are always going to be dysfunctional, and there's always going to be the battle between, good and evil, and the better and worse angels in our nature, in our national character as well. So that's our vision, is both that countering the negative and advancing the positive. And, a lot of it's as well, it's people appreciating each other and valuing each other's humanity. And because in our work we see that happening in the most diverse ways in so many different contexts, it actually is incredibly fulfilling. You get a glimpse of the potential of transcending our divisions in so many different things that we do. So that makes you feel positive. Difference doesn't need to mean division.
I like that. I like that a lot. I also like food. And one of the things we want to know from leaders is if they could have any food to fuel their longest day, what would it be?
Well, I used to do this because in my political life, I had very, very long days, and, the risk is that you eat awful junk food, or, the junk food places aren't even open at the point where you're thinking about, I need some food because, it's 12 at night or whatever. So what I did was I got this, having read about, low GI food and the stuff that sustains you.
You're making me nervous too.
I got into this like hardcore fruit bread that was like thick, heavy as a brick. And this is the thing I carried around with me because I knew that I could survive. All I needed was to take this, it was like a pill. And I'd get up in the morning, because your hours are totally crazy. There'll always be some crisis will be thrown at you. I don't have time to go down to the hotel breakfast room. I'm going to have a cup of tea. I'm going to have some fruit bread, and I'm going to go straight into whatever crisis I have to solve. So that was my secret, was kind of a vaguely healthy way of managing a completely chaotic life. And I don't have I'm not obsessed with needing, never touching that thing again. Sometimes something becomes associated with trauma in life. No, it's not. I think you weren't expecting that, were you?
I absolutely was not, but I am here for it. Tim, we're hugely thankful for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation, and looking forward to continuing that conversation in other spaces at other times. But really excited about all that lies in wait for More in Common.
And excited for Broadstairs and its future, and it's a great privilege to join you in the podcast.
Thanks so much. You've been listening to a Broadstairs Consulting Limited podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Tune in soon to hear the next instalment of The Longest Day. Copyright 2023. Production copyright Broadstairs Consulting Limited. All rights reserved.